Hello there, APUSH students. We're on chapter 35. The Cold War begins 1945 to 1952. So this chapter goes through the beginning of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union and how tensions escalated following World War II. This chapter will also cover how the Cold War affected Americans at home and prompted the Second Red Scare in U.S. history, as people were fearful of communists and radicals. And lastly, there will be some mention of the demographic changes that occurred in the United States in terms of population, where people are living, access to higher education, and the birth rate. So basically, the groundwork for the Cold War is going to explain a lot about America's role in the world today and current geopolitical relations with other countries. So these are very important things to know in order to understand American history going forward. And also with this chapter, in contrast to some others, it's really important to know the timeline and progression because there is an incremental escalation of tensions over a bunch of different incidents between the United States and the Soviet Union. So let's get started. So we're actually going to define the Cold War on the next slide, but in order to understand why the United States and the Soviet Union became enemies, it's important to understand how things were wrapping up with World War II. So in 1945, at the Yalta Conference, which was in February, so 3 months before VE Day, the Big Three, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, met to talk about the post-war world and how things were going to be reconstructed going forward. The entire European continent was devastated by World War II, so they wanted to meet to figure out what was going to happen. So at this conference, they assigned occupation zones in Germany for when the war was going to be over, and they were going to be overseen by each of the countries from the Big Three, and also including France, so 4 zones. It also allowed for free elections to be held in Bulgaria and Romania, which were 2 countries that had been a part of the Axis powers. As for Poland, the country that had been invaded by Hitler at the start of World War II, Stalin agreed that there would be a representative government that would have free elections. So regarding Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania, Stalin is going to reverse all of these positions and is only going to prop up communist governments in these countries. If you're familiar with American democracy, this was not well received by the Americans who felt the Soviets were exerting their influence over these countries and are trying to dominate the world, essentially. And they're taking advantage of the fact that the war is ending and there's a lot of chaos to impose communist rule and control over other countries. So one other part of the Yalta Conference that's important to understand is that the Soviet Union agreed to enter the war in the Pacific 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. So keep in mind, they didn't know when the end of the war was going to be in Europe, but it's ultimately on May 8th. So the Russians enter the war in the Pacific on August 8th, right around the time the atomic bombs were dropped. So there had been conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union before World War II happened. The Soviet Union was a communist country established in 1923, and its style of government basically became an authoritarian dictatorship. So the United States did not even recognize the Soviet Union as a country until 1933. When World War II happened, they became an ally of the United States, in large part because we were both fighting a common enemy, right, the Nazis. So, when that war was going on, though, the Soviets were taking the full force of the Nazi war machine, and millions of Soviets were dying. And the other allies, Britain and the United States, had been hesitant to open another front in Europe to try to relieve some of that pressure. And America claimed that the troops weren't really well trained, and so the North African route happened. But the fact that that second front took a long time to open, not until June of 1944, that made the Soviet Union very suspicious. And then as soon as the war ended in 1945, the United States abruptly ended that Lend-Lease aid that they had been giving to the USSR since 1940. And this was a time when they needed loans to help reconstruct their country. So just look at this from a Soviet perspective for a second. The United States, doesn't open that second front. They cut off aid. They seem to be antagonistic towards them. So the Soviet Union, from its perspective, is taking steps to provide for its own security. Because they had just fought 2 wars against Germany over the 20th century and had lost millions of their people. So that's part of the motivation behind the Soviet Union imposing communist rule in Eastern European countries. They wanted countries that were going to, be on the same diplomatic page with them. All right, so then from the perspective of the United States, a country that is very much a capitalist country and a democratic republic, the United States was in a position to promote its values around the world and protect against what they saw as communist expansion. So this sets the stage for what becomes known as the Cold War, which is a way to define relations between the Soviet Union and the United States between 1945 and 1989. It's a very tense time between these 2 countries. And the Cold War ends when the Soviet Union breaks up. But during most of the 20th century, you had a lot of tensions between the USSR and the United States that took many different forms. It's called the Cold War because there was never an open war between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, there was always a degree of tension between these two powers, and there are going to be flare-ups of the Cold War in other places where the Soviets are supporting one group and the United States is supporting another group. This also leads to spying, espionage. The United States is going to overthrow some democratically elected leaders in some countries, and the United States is also going to intervene in some wars to try to stop communism from taking over in other places. So this is going to dictate American foreign policy for most of the 20th century. If you're familiar with FDR's speech on the Four Freedoms, you have an idea for the post-war world that Roosevelt envisioned, which is basically a world where people have the power to determine their own government and could trade freely, which would essentially create freedom from fear and freedom from want. There is going to be a number of conferences that are going to establish groups aimed at achieving this. So at the Bretton Woods Conference, for example, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank are established to help regulate the global currency exchange rates and aid economic growth in underdeveloped areas. In 1945, the United Nations was established, and it's kind of like the League of Nations, but with a little more power given to the Allied countries from World War II. Basically, other nations have the power to control the General Assembly, but the Security Council had a permanent membership of the big five countries of the USSR, US, France, Britain, and China that could help steer foreign policies and vote on measures. Early in the United Nations history, they did have a little bit of success in mediating conflicts in the areas of Iran and Kashmir, and in the establishment of the State of Israel. Turning to Germany, the country that was completely devastated by World War II, its industrial capabilities had been destroyed. So the big question was how to rebuild the country to make sure that the Nazi Party couldn't come to power again and prevent them from ever trying to do anything like they did with World War II. So one of the first things that was done was the Nuremberg War Crimes Trial. This international group put 22 top Nazi officials on trial for crimes against the laws of war and crimes against humanity. Keep in mind, these laws didn't really exist before World War II, but what the Nazis had done with the Holocaust and provoking this war were seen as so egregious that there was a demand for the people to be brought to justice. Ultimately, 12 of the accused Nazis were executed. So as I mentioned with the Yalta Conference, the country of Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. The 3 western zones were controlled by Britain, France, and the United States. They kind of blend together over time, and the United States supports democratic governments in these regions, while the Soviet zone in the east installs a communist regime that is basically controlled by the Soviet Union. So this leads to the line between communist countries and Western European countries to be called the Iron Curtain, which behind the Iron Curtain meant being in a communist country where your rights could be restricted and your movement could be restricted. So over the course of the Cold War, we're going to see the development of these regions as communist countries and a solidification of what becomes known as the Iron Curtain. Berlin, however, was a different story because the capital of Germany was well into the Soviet zone. So the post-war agreement was that Berlin would be divided into 4 occupation zones, with the Soviets controlling the eastern zone. Here's a map showing the division of Germany. By 1949, the countries of East Germany and West Germany are established. The capital of East Germany was Berlin, and the capital of West Germany was the city of Bonn. West Germany also had control over West Berlin, which is inside East Germany. The Berlin Wall is not going to be built until 1961, but if you're familiar with the Berlin Wall, it was a barrier that separated East Berlin from West Berlin. As soon as this division takes shape, the Soviets try to make a claim over West Berlin by blockading all land access from West Germany to West Berlin because West Germany engaged in some currency reforms. So the United States had to decide on how they were going to help West Berlin because they didn't want Berlin to fall to the communist government, but the people of West Berlin were going to starve without any kind of assistance. So the United States responds by airlifting supplies into West Berlin in what becomes known as the Berlin Airlift. The Soviets allow the United States to fly planes in and resupply the people of West Berlin, and this blockade and airlift goes on for an entire year. At the height of the airlift, a plane was taking off and landing about every 30 seconds, and the citizens of West Berlin were actually being supplied better than they had been before the blockade. So why would the United States do this? Basically, Berlin became a symbol of resistance against communist aggression and communist expansion. So there was this need from the United States and from Western countries not to let West Berlin fall to the Soviets, because if that happens, there is a belief that the Soviets will then be empowered to expand further. So this is one of the first standoffs in the Cold War, and you're going to see many other instances where the United States is going to put money or troops or influence in other parts of the world because they don't want to see the Soviets gain the upper hand. Over the course of the 1940s, the Cold War is going to deepen, with the United States adopting more aggressive measures against the Soviets. These are going to take a lot of different forms. So the first of these is the containment doctrine, adopted in 1947. The person who crafted this idea was George Kennan, who was a longtime diplomat who claimed to understand the mindset of the Soviets. And basically, Kennan said that Russia will always be an expansionist country, and the only way to stop this is to contain it and to be vigilant in trying to halt Soviet expansion. Basically, the idea was that the Russians will only respond to force, and the United States needed to be prepared to meet the Soviet Union with force to show they were not willing to be walked on. So a continuation of this containment idea comes in what's known as the Truman Doctrine. Basically, there was some communist insurgents in Greece and Turkey who were trying to make those countries into communist countries. And Truman went to Congress, who at the time was very reluctant to spend more money, and Truman tried to convince them that aid to Greece and Turkey was necessary. In his speech, he basically says that it's the responsibility of the United States to provide aid to people resisting communist aggression. And if the United States did not act, they could risk having communism expand to other parts of the world. So basically, it scared the Congress into saying that if they don't give up the money to countries in danger of falling to communism, Soviets could end up dominating the world, essentially. So that's one form of containment policy, and this is going to be continued by the Marshall Plan, because this aid ends up going to Greece and Turkey. And, it's about, I forget how much the figure is, but it's a relatively small amount. The Marshall Plan is basically a continuation of that policy by providing other nations with money and support to try to build up their democratic and capitalist institutions. So the Marshall Plan is named after Secretary of State George Marshall, and it was financial aid that was offered to European countries. At the time, the price tag amounted to $12 billion, which was a huge sum at the time. This was offered to the Soviet Union, but they rejected it, saying that it was basically a capitalist ploy. So something also very notable during the 1940s that's going to increase tensions with not only the Soviet Union, but with Middle Eastern countries, is the United Nations Charter that established Israel as a country in 1948. The establishment of Israel was the culmination of both Jewish settlers in the region of Palestine that had been moving there over the course of the 20th century, but also millions of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust who were following ideas of establishing a Jewish homeland in order to prevent something like the Holocaust from happening again. As soon as the charter is granted, President Truman and the United States formally recognized Israel as a country. This is going to complicate relations between Arab nations and the United States for many, many years to come. Here is a map showing foreign aid being given to other parts of the world. So the United States being, one of the surviving, probably the strongest survivor from World War II and the largest economic powerhouse in the world, is offering this financial aid to these countries to try to stop the spread of communism. So far, we've talked about, economic responses. 3, 2, 1. So far, we've talked about economic applications of containment doctrine. Let's talk about some of the military implications. So in 1947, the Department of Defense is created, what formerly was the Department of War. This also leads to the creation of the National Security Council and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to advise the President on security matters, and also leads to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, which would coordinate the government's foreign fact-finding. Under the CIA, agents are going to be deployed around the world, and many are going to spy for the United States. So the U.S. would also take a major step by joining a European defensive pact known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Basically, NATO consisted of Western European nations that would back each other up in the event of attack. So basically, if the Soviet Union tried to expand to these countries, they were threatened with military force from all of the other nations. So this was basically aimed at trying to stop Soviet expansion, and that's why the United States joins. The Soviet Union is going to respond by forming the Warsaw Pact in 1954, which is only going to increase these tensions further. Meanwhile, the United States wants to make sure to stop communist governments from coming up in Asia, so they focus on trying to rebuild Japan to be a strong democracy. Essentially, the United States forced the Japanese to adopt a constitution that called for a democratic government, a scaled-down military, and equal rights for women. The Japanese were very quick to accept this constitution, and after a small war crimes trial in which about 7 top Japanese officials were executed for war crimes, the stage was set for Japan to become a thriving economy once again. There's also an important reason why the United States is going to support Japan and is going to be a close ally with them, which is that in 1949, communists take over China and the People's Republic of China is established. A communist civil war had been going on in China since the 1920s, and it resumed after World War II. Because of the communist revolution in China, over 500 million more people were now in a communist country, which was seen as very alarming to the United States. The communist revolution in China was a setback for the United States and their interests, and later that year, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. They had developed the bomb much faster than anyone had expected, and as it's later discovered, because they had agents within the Manhattan Project who stole nuclear secrets and brought them back to Russia. Because they now had the atomic bomb, there is a fear that they're going to use it. So this leads to an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union to try to develop bigger bombs and delivery systems. And this is meant to try to deter the other nation from using their weapons. So shortly after the Soviets detonate their first atomic bomb, the United States undertakes research on the hydrogen bomb and tests their first one in 1952. And in 1953, the Soviets test their first hydrogen bomb as well. So just to put this in perspective, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had the destructive power of 10 and 15 kilotons of TNT, respectively. So that's 10,000 tons of TNT, the bomb in Hiroshima. The hydrogen bomb detonated in 1952 was 100,000 kilotons. So 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So this arms race is escalating very quickly. Up until the Korean War, the United States had been building up its military and weapons and giving financial aid to other countries. But the situation in Korea is actually going to put American boots on the ground to stop communist expansion. Since the late 1800s, Korea had been a part of the Japanese Empire, and after the war, the country was split along the 38th parallel, with the Soviets controlling the northern half and the United States supporting the southern half. A communist government takes shape in North Korea, and in June of 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea with the goal of unifying the country under a communist government. President Truman viewed this as an example of containment doctrine, and the United States was obligated to stand up to communist expansion with a military response. So even though this was technically a police action on the part of the United Nations, the United States supplies 88% of the military power to help defend South Korea. In the lower left map, you can see how the UN and South Korean forces were able to push North Korean forces all the way up to the northern border of the country, which then prompted the communist Chinese government to provide aid to the North Koreans. So the Chinese attacked the United Nations forces. So after 2 years of stalemate, an armistice is reached in 1953 that stops the fighting. And that is the reason that North and South Korea exist today, and technically they're still at war, and the border between North and South Korea is known as the Demilitarized Zone. So the Korean War really freaks out the United States, and the National Security Council drafts a memorandum that recommends the United States increase its defense spending to prevent potential communist attacks. It's their 68th memo, so it becomes known as NSC 68 because these measures are adopted by the United States. And it is a very pivotal document in the United States because it's going to basically quadruple the amount of military spending the United States is going to be putting towards defending countries against communism and promoting this containment theory. Because of all this fear of communism abroad, that is definitely going to lead to people at home being fearful of communism and trying to find communists that are undermining the government at home. This leads to the second Red Scare in American history, where people with unpopular views could lose their jobs and their livelihoods or face going to prison. In 1947, President Truman launched a loyalty program for federal employees. It meant that they could not advocate for the overthrow of the government or belong to groups that held subversive ideas. Over the 1940s and 50s, about 2,700 people were fired and about 12,000 people resigned from federal jobs because of this loyalty program. This is also a time when the House Un-American Activities Committee gains more attention. Basically, the House of Representatives have different subcommittees that investigate different things. And HUAC, as it's sometimes known, had actually been around since 1938 to investigate subversive activities in America. But after 1945, this fear of communism really ramps up, and the House Un-American Activities Committee launches investigations into a number of organizations to determine if they are harmful to the government. One of the places they investigated in 1947 was the Hollywood movie industry, which was accused of having pro-Soviet views. So If you had ever been a member of the Communist Party at any time in your life, you could be called before the House committee, and which you can't refuse to go to. It's essentially a subpoena, right? And then if you go there, you have to answer the questions that they're giving you, or that's considered contempt of court, and you can go to jail for that. You can choose to not incriminate yourself, which is called invoking your Fifth Amendment privileges. But in many of these committee hearings, HUAC chair people decided that the Fifth Amendment didn't actually apply and they couldn't use Fifth Amendment protection. So people were basically denied their constitutional rights in these committee hearings, and anyone who was deemed a communist would be blacklisted from ever working in Hollywood again. So we have people that lose their jobs because they were once a member of the Communist Party or they advocated for, communist views. And then you also had a number of prominent screenwriters known as the Hollywood 10 who actually stood up to the HUAC committee, and they ended up going to prison for refusing to answer questions from these committees. Another event that occurs that scares people about communism in the United States is the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1951. They were accused of running a spy ring that smuggled nuclear secrets to the Soviets. They were convicted in 1953 and were both executed. People often get the House Un-American Activities Committee confused with Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism, so let's straighten that out real quick. Joe McCarthy was a junior senator from Wisconsin who accused the Secretary of State in 1950 of knowingly employing 205 communists. He claims to have their names on a list and urged the Secretary of State to fire them, essentially. McCarthy never actually produced a list and never identified a single communist in the State Department, but that doesn't stop him from accusing people of having communist sympathies or for being communists themselves. Without very little proof, McCarthy launched investigations, and simply naming someone as a communist or accusing someone was basically enough for them to lose their job or be blacklisted. So McCarthy is a senator, HUAC is in the House, so two different branches of Congress. If we're looking and kind of judging these actions, McCarthy's actions were deemed to be, a lot worse than what HUAC was trying to do. If you question Joe McCarthy's methods, you would be labeled a communist by him. And since people were so afraid of communists, they weren't looking for a lot of proof at that time. So HUAC was doing its own thing, Joseph McCarthy was doing its own thing and trying to expose communism within the ranks of government. These were completely unfounded claims, and the term McCarthyism is now applied to somebody who brings up claims without evidence for the purpose of tarnishing someone's public image. The downfall of Joseph McCarthy came when he accused the army of harboring communists, and the army really took him to task and forced him to produce evidence. Not only that, but the hearings were televised. So over the course of 35 days, people got to see the tactics of Joe McCarthy used on people, and public opinion about him declined sharply after the Army McCarthy hearings. Shortly after these hearings, McCarthy was censured by the Senate, which is basically a formal declaration that he had participated in conduct unbecoming a member of Congress. So he didn't get removed from office, but he basically just was kind of chastised by the Senate for doing things that were not deemed to be, worthy of that office. He's going to die of alcohol-related illnesses 3 years after this, but his legacy in American history is secured as somebody who exploited the fears of the American people for political gain. I mentioned the inclusion of Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance because it just shows how much America's fears of communism and the way Americans saw themselves in their own society, it really matters during this time. Many Americans viewed the Cold War in religious terms and felt they were fighting a force of evil. And also, since communism doesn't necessarily advocate any particular religion, and Karl Marx made some negative remarks about the role of religion, many communist countries discouraged religious worship. Therefore, Congress in 1954 voted to add the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance as a way of identifying religious belief as an American trait. Similar to the years after World War I, there's a wave of post-war strikes after World War II. Many people joined organized labor during World War II, and organized labor had grown since the Wagner Act in the 1930s, which alarmed a lot of conservatives. So in 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which dealt a blow to the labor unions. The act outlawed closed shops, meaning that there was a requirement that all members of the trade had to join a union, and it required union leaders to take a non-communist oath. Basically, it was aimed at reducing union membership, and you were going to see a decline in union membership after World War II. That's due in part to the Taft-Hartley Act, but it's also part of the changing economy of the United States. One of the most significant pieces of legislation passed during this time is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which is known as the GI Bill, passed in 1946. Basically, it provided financial assistance to any veteran returning from the war until they could find work. So it was kind of temporary unemployment insurance. But the most significant part of this act was that it also gave a lot of financial aid to veterans to pursue higher education. That means that millions of young men who probably couldn't afford college before are now going to get the opportunity because they served in the military. By the time the original bill ended in 1956, about 8 million of the 16 million who served in World War II are going to go to college, which is going to be really helpful in transforming America into more of a service-based economy. And this bill has been renewed many, many times and continues to provide military veterans with a virtually free education. I want to talk briefly about the 1948 Democratic Convention because Harry Truman took over the presidency after FDR died. He's going to face criticism within his own party for a number of reasons. For one thing, he is seen as being too tough on the Soviets or too aggressive with his Cold War policies, or he's seen as not being progressive enough with some of the New Dealers, and he desegregated the military by executive order in 1948, which showed his commitment to civil rights, and that's going to alienate some of the Southern Democrats, also known as the Dixiecrats. So Truman was able to squeak out the nomination, but that led to the formation of two rival political parties that break away from the Democrats in 1948. The States Rights Party, basically an anti-civil rights party, and the Progressive Party, led by FDR's former vice president, Henry Wallace. Because the Democratic Party was split, Republicans were sure their candidate, Thomas E. Dewey, was going to win, so he didn't really do that much campaigning. Truman, on the other hand, led this crazy tour around the country, basically railed against Republican Congress as not really doing anything. People were so sure he was going to lose that you see this famous picture, Truman is holding up a copy of the Chicago Tribune that mistakenly called the victory for Dewey. However, Truman won with 303 electoral votes to Dewey's 189. Not only that, but the Democrats took control over Congress again. So at the beginning of Truman's second term, he proposes sweeping legislation known as the Fair Deal. Among some of the provisions were improved housing, full employment, national health insurance, a higher minimum wage, better farm price supports, and extensions of Social Security. There were still enough Republicans and Southern Democrats to block a lot of that legislation, but some things that do end up becoming a part of the agenda were a National Housing Act, a minimum wage increase, and extensions in Social Security for the elderly. So here's a map of the 1948 election. The last thing I want to talk about in this lecture are some of the demographic changes that occur during this time period. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, more Americans were moving into the Sun Belt for work, and there's a population increase in those areas, which is basically in the southeast and the southwest. Also during this time, there's a massive amount of movement to suburban communities from the cities. New Deal policies from the Federal Housing Administration and benefits from the Veterans Administration for home loans made this move to the suburbs happen. It basically been happening since the 1920s, but it's really going to take off after World War II. In 1956, Congress passes legislation that approves the building of thousands of miles of interstate highways to link up the cities. So this leads to an explosion of highway construction, which is going to cause the cities to depopulate in the mid to late 20th centuries. Also part of the demographic shift in the United States is the baby boom. Because of America's economic prosperity after the war and the economy was really good, the birth rate in the United States is going to add 50 million people to the population by the end of the 1950s. So you're going to see a population explosion right after World War II. Here's a map showing population increases in the Sun Belt. The places in yellow are kind of like the Sun Belt states. I don't know what New Hampshire is doing up there, but that's not part of the Sun Belt, okay? All right, there's the timeline. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any questions.